To me. There we go. Now we're live. Okay, sorry, folks. We had a little technical glitch there, but we are now live or recorded for those who are viewing after. And I'm joined by Dr. Brian Cutter. And we're going to talk about whether color is in things. What an interesting question. What an actually very important question, right? There's a lot of wider implications around this. And the question of sensory realism or color realism is one that's fascinated me for a long time for a lot of different reasons. And I forget how I discovered your paper, Brian, but I did, and then I emailed you because I wanted to read it, and that sort of led to this podcast. And I loved it. It was great, and I thought, well, that'll be a fun thing to talk about on philosophy for the people. You've also done a lot of cool work in other areas too, and you've been on a couple other podcasts discussing another paper of yours of an argument from psychophysical harmony to theism. So if we have time, maybe we can touch on that a little bit as well.
Great.
But for now, welcome to the show. It's really good to have you, and thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Happy to be here.
So, since this is your first time on the show, if you wouldn't mind, give us a brief introduction. Who are you? What do you do? How'd you get interested in the question of whether apples are actually red and all that sort of thing?
Well, let's see. So my name is Brian Cutter. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. How did I get interested in questions about the metaphysics of color? I mean, I guess I've been into philosophy at least since college, probably before, and these questions are very very big in the history of philosophy. You read ancient philosophers, early modern philosophers. They're all trying to understand the extent to which the properties presented in experience are kind of really out there, inherent in external things, or the extent to which they're a projection of the mind. This touches on broader questions about the extent to which we can know what reality is like in itself. It's also connected to kind of the mind-body problem.
Right.
The color qualities are, have often been thought to be kind of qualitative features of our experiences or of the mind, and given certain conceptions about what the physical world is like, that gives rise to a particularly stark version of the mind-body problem. So
Right.
I mean, I mainly work in philosophy of mind, thinking about questions about the nature of perception, the nature of consciousness, but those questions are intimately bound up with questions about color and other sensible qualities. What's the nature of our kind of perceptual relation to the world? So yeah, that was just a natural issue to get into. I ended up writing my dissertation mainly on the metaphysics of the sensible qualities, and I've published a lot on those issues, but also kind of connected questions about the nature of consciousness. So
Yeah. Well, great. You sort of already started answering what my first question was going to be, and that was, what are some of the wider implications? Like, why should people care about whether color is in things, or whether apples are really red? Or like, it might seem on the surface, oh well, who cares, right? Who cares? But as you've begun to tease out that there's implications here, at least to what we might think are some bigger questions about our relation to the world, the mind body problem. So I don't know, how would you motivate it any further than what you've said already?
yeah, so there are a number of reasons why you might care. I mean, one is you might just want to know
It's just interesting. Yeah.
what is the world like? What is the kind of objective physical world like? What are its basic features? There are arguments that if there are colors in the world, they can't be reducible to kind of underlying physical features of the kind discovered by the physical sciences. And so it would be at least an interesting result if there are kind of more qualities out there in the world than are countenanced by our kind of best physical theories. So that's one just kind of flat-footed.
Yep.
If you're interested in metaphysics and what reality is like, what are the basic qualities out in the world, that would be one reason to care. Another is kind of epistemological. So it's natural to think that perception presents us with how the world is in itself. Perception gives us a window on the world. That's at least kind of our naive conception of what perception does. Perception gives us a window on the world, presenting to us the way the world is in itself, at least in the good case. Of course, we know you can take drugs and hallucinate, you can dream. There are cases where things go awry, but we ordinarily think that like when things are functioning properly, in the normal case, in the good case, perception is a window on the world. It makes the world manifest to mind. But, the question of whether colors and other sensible qualities are really out there in the world is relevant to this question about the nature of perception. Does perception give us a window on the world, or are we, in the phrase of some philosophers, are we trapped behind the veil of perception, where perception kind of gives us, like internal sense data? You might think like a virtual image, a virtual model of the world. You might imagine a picture of a perception where we always have, as it were, virtual reality goggles on through which reality is filtered. In that case, maybe we can't have direct access to what the world is like in itself. And if perception doesn't give us direct access to what the world is like in itself, then there's a question as to whether we can know anything about what the world is like in and of itself. I mean, Kant thought that we can know the world of appearance, roughly how things relate to us and their appearances, but we can know nothing of how things are in and of themselves.
Right.
There are certain views about the nature of color and other sensible qualities that would encourage that kind of Kantian vision, other views that might steer away from it. So that's a kind of an epistemological angle. If you want to know how and whether we can know about the world and what it's like taken intrinsically, that's a reason to care about these questions about the metaphysics of sensible qualities. I guess a final consideration is, if you're interested in the nature of the mind, the nature of consciousness, how consciousness is related to matter, the traditional mind-body problem, then insofar as colors are connected to conscious states, colors seem to be directly presented in certain states of consciousness, then I think understanding the nature of colors is going to be relevant to understanding the nature of consciousness and understanding the kind of relationship between mind and matter, which is kind of, I guess, my main philosophical interest.
Yeah, great. Well, that's a great example of how in philosophy, the moment you ask one question, you ask every question, right?
Yeah.
So here we go. I love your paper because it's got a great narrative to it. You start us off in paradise, right? In the world of appearances. And for most people, most of the time, it just seems like color is in things, right? But then there was a fall. We ate from the tree of science, as you explain it. So you wrote this story, so you tell it. Set us up how you like to frame this narrative, and then we'll start getting into your actual account, if you don't mind, Brian.
Yeah. So the background story that's driving the paper is actually borrowed from David Chalmers. David Chalmers wrote a paper called "Perception in the Fall from Eden," and in his story, in the Garden of Eden, we think things kind of had primitive, glorious colors. So the apple that we saw was primitively, gloriously red, and we are directly acquainted with the redness of the apple. And the redness of the apple, it wasn't just a projection of the mind out into the world. It wasn't just a quality of our experiences or our internal images or sense data. No, the redness of the apple was kind of out there on the surface of the apple, just as it naively appears to be. And we just kind of directly mentally perceive the qualities of the external world. Then Chalmers argues, we ate from the tree of science and the tree of illusion. The tree of illusion basically just refers to the fact that we realize that sometimes things can seem to be a certain way, but not be that way. So the stick in water looks bent, but really it's straight. We have dreams where, things seem to be presented to us, but, there's nothing really there. Okay, so we know that we can seem to be acquainted with this glorious external reality, but that's merely an illusion or a hallucination. So that's one initial reason to start doubting that colors and other qualities that we experience are really out in the world. A more serious consideration for Chalmers is what he calls the tree of science. Basically, he thinks we've got strong reasons from science to think that color as we see it only lives in the mind, or doesn't really live out on the surfaces of objects as it seems to. And he gives a number of considerations here. One is just that, we discovered that the apple or the tomato or whatever it is that looks kind of gloriously primitively red turns out to be made of small colorless atoms. And it's natural to think that, something that's made of a bunch of colorless atoms couldn't magically be colored at the higher level.
Right.
There's a kind of principle that, like, if something is primitively red, it can't be fully decomposable into things that aren't even colored at all.
Yeah.
Another argument he gives is, has to do with, well, we've got a kind of scientific story for why things look red. Namely, the surface of the object has a certain kind of microstructure, which leads it to reflect and absorb light in certain ways. And then the light reflects into our eyes and stimulates our sense receptors. And we've got a story about like the different kinds of sense receptors that are sensitive to different wavelengths of light and how those feed into like opponent color channels in the brain and generate the kind of human color space that we're familiar with. And that whole story just doesn't require the existence of colors out there in the world. You can tell the whole story just in terms of, reflecting and absorbing wavelengths of light and rods and cones and opponent channels in the brain and so on. And so to go on and say like, oh, and by the way, there's also colors out there, even though we don't need to posit colors in order to explain anything about color perception, that just seems theoretically unparsimonious. It seems like something we shouldn't do on grounds of Occam's razor. So he thinks these and other related considerations from science should lead us to the conclusion that color as we see it isn't out there in the world. On his view, color experience is kind of a big illusion, at least in one sense. The primitive qualities that objects seem to have, they don't really have. They only kind of live in the contents of perception.
Right.
And then okay, so that's kind of the Chalmers background. But then my paper that you cite, called Paradise Regained, argues, well, actually, maybe we can reconcile color realism and realism about these other sensible qualities with what we know from science. And so what I do is, first of all, I try to push back a little bit on the scientific considerations, but then more positively, I give a kind of positive model for how it is that color is related to the kind of what science tells us about the world in a way that I argue kind of makes room for realism about color and these other sensible qualities.
Yeah, well, there were a number of things in your paper that were absolutely fascinating. And as always, I'll put a link below and encourage people to read the full thing because can't cover every detail on a podcast, right? Just trying to get people interested in the topic. And I liked your pushback and the quibbles you had with Chalmers' account. So if you wouldn't mind, I'd like you to spell out a few of those quibbles because I think that is an important aspect of the wider debate. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good. So I wrote this back, and this is basically.
I know. Yeah, if it's not totally fresh in your memory, don't worry about it.
Let's see if I can remember it.
So, but even the notion of perceptual equivalence not mapping on with the deeper scientific account of things, I think is an important thing that a lot of people are probably unaware of, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good. So one quibble I had with Chalmers' kind of scientific argument against color realism was, he says, well, we've got this complete scientific story of why it is that of our color experiences, why it is that things seem to have certain colors. And that story doesn't involve the postulation of any colors. And so he says, well, if we don't need to posit colors out in the world in order to explain our color experiences, then there's no reason to believe in them. I mean, so that, that the background principle here, I think, is pretty good. Like, if there's no reason to posit unicorns in order to explain all of our evidence, then, it still could be that there are unicorns, but like that wouldn't be a justified.
Right. Yeah, there's no good reason to actually accept the unicorn theory, right? Mm-hmm.
Right. But the one thing that's a little bit fishy about Chalmers' argument is he's assuming that our evidence is just the fact that we have certain color experiences, whereas I think it's pretty natural to take the view where like, no, the evidence, the thing that scientific posits need to explain include facts like, this is red, or, there's a chair over there, or, so if you just think of like what scientists do, they say, well, my measuring device had such and such reading, so that's the data that needs to be explained, and then maybe I postulate some unobserved thing in order to explain it. But scientists don't say the data that needs to be explained is I had such and such subjective experiences. No, like we ordinarily think that we can take it as evidence certain kind of external world propositions that perception delivers to us. So
Yeah.
perception tells us, that the measuring device had such and such reading. We can take that as given. I mean, not with absolute certainty. We might find out we were hallucinating, but like provisionally, we can take that as given, as a kind of defeasibly justified belief, and then we can ask what explains why the measurement device had such and such reading. But ordinary scientific practice does not assume that our evidence is limited to private subjective experiences. There's also kind of external world propositions that we immediately get via perception that we can legitimately treat as evidence. Right. And Chalmers' argument is kind of assuming that like we're only justified in believing that things are read if the postulation that things are read is necessary in order to explain something else. But that assumes that the tomatoes being red isn't part of our bare evidence that we're defeasibly justified in believing. In the background kind of epistemological framework I work with in the paper is what's called phenomenal conservatism, which just says, if it seems to you that P, then you have at least a feasible justification to believe that P. So if it seems to you that there's a hand here, then you're justified in believing that there's a hand here. That doesn't mean that you couldn't get further evidence that convinced you, oh, I'm hallucinating, or that was an illusion, or whatever. But there's a kind of like default justification that comes with appearances. And I think something like that has got to be correct. Otherwise, it's hard to stave off a kind of radical skepticism. And that's a very popular view within philosophy. So if you accept that view, then you should think that, well, we're just kind of defeasibly justified in believing things are read just because things appear to be read, not because things being read is the best explanation of their appearing so, but just because if it appears that way, then you get a kind of default entitlement to believe it.
Yeah. I just actually spent a good amount of time with Humer's new book on knowledge, so I've got his PC principle fresh in my mind. Good. And that you're right. Something like that seems like it has to be the case if we're not just going to like descend into a swift pit of nonsense and skepticism. But of course, again, reiterating that it's defeasible, right? We could get some further evidence that could cause us to give up that commitment. So good. Okay, yeah. So let's continue then. I guess with your, you tell me what you think the best move would be at this point. Should we start working towards your reconciliation, or should we? Because you did give another attempt that you think ultimately doesn't work, a particular grounding attempt. So yeah, you tell me which way you want to go with it. Yep.
Good. Well, so maybe let me just say one more thing. This falls in the quibble about Chalmers' scientific argument. So one thing he says, which I think is just not true, is that we can fully explain color experience without positing colors out in the world. And in a way, for reasons that Chalmers is very familiar with, that's not totally true, because in order to explain color experience, you'd need to explain the phenomenology, the felt character of color experience without positing colors. And that's a very hard problem. Chalmers coined the term that the hard problem of consciousness, which is basically just like the mystery. Like, why is it, given that my brain is doing all sorts of fancy stuff, that I have any experiences at all, including an experience of vivid red? And he says, and I think this is right, that that's kind of like the deepest mystery in all of science. And we just don't have a good story for like why it is that anyone is conscious at all, why it is that anyone has experiences of vivid red. And so the idea that like we have like a perfectly good scientific explanation for why things look red,
it delays,
independent of positing colors is wrong. Now you could argue like, okay, but positing colors doesn't help. But one thing I say is like, well, it could be that if there are colors in the world, that could play a role in explaining why there are experiences of red. And I don't really like spell out how that goes, but the thought is like, well, the thought is like, well, maybe to have an experience of red is just to perceptually represent that something is red. And maybe the story for what it takes to perceptually represent something as red requires some kind of relationship between you and redness in the world. And in that case, you actually would want redness in the world as part of the overall explanation for how things can look red. And a lot of people have developed this idea. I'm a little more skeptical of it now than I was when I when I initially wrote that paper. But there's at least some reason to think like maybe the existence of redness in the world could explain, why we have experiences of the kind that we do.
Yeah, and just to draw out one of the implications here is if you accept sort of what Chalmers is getting at, that there's nothing about the sort of quantitative aspects of reality that can make sense of color. That would include, of course, all the quantitative aspects of us and our brain and all that too, right? So now you're in a position where you might just be pushed towards a hard substance dualism or something like that, right? So it's not difficult to see why, if you kind of accept a lot of these starting points, you're kind of between a rock and a hard place here. I mean, it's like where are you going to go? Are you going to go and become a strong substance dualist, or maybe an eliminativist, or something like that? I don't think there are good options if you accept that particular starting point, which is, I guess, where we're going to be going to challenge here presently, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good. So then, I mean, kind of the positive proposal that I develop in that paper takes as its starting point an idea from Bertrand Russell, Arthur Eddington, and a number of others who say that, like, look, physics are kind of physical scientific descriptions of the world. They only give us the structure of the world, but they don't tell us what the kind of intrinsic nature of the world. So they give us the kind of relational structure. They kind of say how things are spatiotemporally related, how things are causally related to one another, how things push and pull on one another, but they don't give us the kind of intrinsic qualitative nature of matter.
Now, I just want to emphasize how important this move is, because you're sort of rejecting a hardball physicalism and scientism here, right? And the position that it seems to me like you are just kind of bringing in like an epistemic structural realism. Is that right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a bit like epistemic structuralism, where epistemic structuralism says that, like, all we can know about the world is this kind of like abstract relational structure. I would qualify that to say all that kind of all the physical sciences tell us about the world is its abstract relational structure. Maybe there's other ways of knowing about the kind of intrinsic qualitative nature, and I guess the upshot of the paper is one way of knowing that is just by ordinary perception. But the thought is, like, standard physical scientific descriptions of the world are limited in what they tell us. They tell us certain things, but they leave out other things. And so the mere fact that our physical scientific descriptions of the tomato, say, in terms of its atomic microstructure and so forth, the mere fact that those descriptions leave out the qualities of color shouldn't convince us that there is no color in the tomato, because we've already decided, kind of on these independent grounds, that physics is not in the business of telling us about the intrinsic qualities of matter. It's only in the business of telling us kind of roughly the causal structure of reality, what Russell calls the causal skeleton of the world.
And that is not only, I think, correct, but a really important insight, right? Because an example that's sometimes used to illustrate your point is like, look, a metal detector is really powerful at detecting metal. But just because it doesn't pick up plastic, it'd be crazy to think that plastic doesn't exist, right? And that's sort of what we're saying here. Like, the stuff physics picks up, it's great at it, right? But we're just saying it doesn't pick up everything, and it'd be kind of crazy, or at least unjustified, to think that whatever it doesn't pick up isn't really there. In fact, it has to be there for physics to make sense, especially since it's talking about a relational structure, right?
Yeah, so there's this further argument that, well, first, as you said, just because it doesn't pick it up doesn't mean it's not there. But then I think more importantly, secondly, some have thought, and Russell kind of thought this, that it doesn't even make metaphysical sense to think that something could just have no intrinsic nature at all. We know that physics doesn't tell us the intrinsic nature of the fundamental physical things, like the basic elementary particles, for example. But I can get in the mood, and many have thought this, that there's a kind of metaphysical incoherence to thinking that there's a thing that just has no intrinsic nature at all, a kind of bare particular or something. And so if you think that, well, the abstract structure described by physics needs to be grounded in or underwritten by or realized by some kind of intrinsic qualities, then you already think that there must be such qualities. Now that's neutral as to their nature. But then we have from perception this evidence that like there are these qualities out in the world, like colors and the other sensible qualities. And so we kind of like, okay, we've got this job description, the qualities that need to realize the structures described by physics, and now like we have some hint as to like what they could be. And my proposal in the paper is not exactly that colors are what realize the structure. My claim is that there's some kind of qualitative underpinning to what physics describes, and that qualitative underpinning grounds kind of at a higher level of description the colors and other sensible qualities.
You call them the quiddities.
Yeah,
right?
quiddities is the name that's commonly used and what I use in that paper.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, let me. This relates. Our friend Kevin here kind of brings up a question related to what we're saying. He says science does not delve into the intrinsic natures, and he thinks that this is a reason to reject intrinsic natures. So I guess here I just sort of touched on that, Dr. Cutter. I don't know if there's anything else you would want to add if somebody wants to veer in the other direction of this.
Yeah. So I mean, I've said that, you know, some have held that it's kind of incoherent to suppose that there are things that lack intrinsic natures. I'm not so sure that that's right. Maybe there's a coherent view that all there is to reality is structure, and there's no intrinsic qualities that realize that structure. I'm sort of agnostic on that point, but it's at least not ruled out by anything science tells us that there are these kind of quiddities realizing the structures described by physics. And it's a little bit prima facie odd to think that there could be a world without any kind of quiddities realizing the structures described by physics. And moreover, we have some work for them to do. Namely, we've got this prima facie reason to think that there are colors. We've got prima facie reason to think that colors couldn't be grounded purely in the structural stuff that physics tells us about. And it's not so implausible based on what science tells us that there are quiddities realizing that structure. So there's at least some epistemic justification to think that there are quiddities, and moreover, they play the role of grounding the qualities that we're directly aware of in experience.
So the important thing, I guess I'd want to pull out what you're saying is that science itself does not drive in this particular direction. Rather, one's wider metaphysical picture or philosophy of nature or philosophy science is really what's sort of going to determine one's position at the end of the day on this, right?
Yeah, or even just kind of basic epistemology. Like if you go in for the phenomenal conservative view and you think, okay, there's the feasible reason to think that tomatoes are red, but there's no place for redness within, or at least, redness doesn't fall out straightforwardly from the structural descriptions given by the physical sciences, but we have reason to think that, well, maybe those structural descriptions aren't the complete story. Then, it just seems not at all crazy to think that, well, maybe the quantitative realization of those physical structures is also such as to give rise to the qualities we encounter and experience.
Yeah, you're putting it very modestly, not at all crazy. I think it's the obviously correct view. but anyways, continue. Keep giving us your account, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe I should say, that's the broad outline of it. So I borrow this move from a view that's called Russellian monism about consciousness, which basically says about conscious experience what I say about color. So according to Russellian monism about consciousness, we've got this traditional mind-body problem. Given the physical description of what's going on in my brain, it's hard to see why there would be any experiences at all, why there would be any conscious states like feelings of pain or experiences of red. And Russell pointed out that, the stuff that physics tells us doesn't explain that, but physics only tells us this very abstract structural stuff. It doesn't tell us the intrinsic nature of matter. Maybe the intrinsic nature of matter has something to do with consciousness. In a way, at that level of description, I agree, because I think colors are kind of directly related to consciousness, because what it is to have an experience of color is to bear a certain acquaintance relationship to color.
Mhm.
But the way Russellian monists nowadays about consciousness typically go is to say like, well, colors aren't really out in the world, but nonetheless, the story I told about color, that's true for experiences of red, but it's not true
Mhm.
for redness as we experience it. So my thought is just like, well, the kind of Russellian story seems a little bit better suited to explaining qualities like color than it does to explaining the experience of color in any direct way,
Mhm.
because color is what seems like an intrinsic quality. Experiences of color seem like more of a relational thing.
Yeah.
It's,
Mhm.
aware of a quality. And if the Russellian thought was, well, what physics leaves out is the intrinsic qualities. Then it seems like this kind of move is more naturally suited to explaining like how there could be color in the world despite the fact that color seems to be absent from our physical descriptions, than it is suited to explain like how there could be consciousness in the world given that
Yeah.
consciousness is absent from our physical descriptions.
Mhm.
It may be indirectly relevant to the consciousness issue, but my thought is it seems more directly connected to just kind of like thinking about the qualities themselves. And actually, I think Russell's view was kind of like this, though I think Russell was inclined to put the colors kind of physically in our brains.
Mhm.
But I think, again, if you kind of take experience at face value and locate colors where they kind of naively seem to be located, given this phenomenal conservative idea, then it seems natural to put them out in the world.
Yeah. So, perhaps we should talk about your. Sorry, I should have had your paper pulled up while we're going here, so I could have used it as an outline. In fact, I do have it. Here it is. Um, the supervenience account,
Oh,
and specifically, um, I thought a very helpful aspect of your paper was the difference between narrow qualitative grounding and broad qualitative grounding. Um, I don't know. We don't have to go all into technical weeds because people can read the paper as well. But I thought it was very helpful how you spelled these accounts out for just alleviating certain concerns and objections. I know this is a while since you wrote it, so I don't know how fresh this stuff is in
yeah.
your memory, but yeah.
Yeah, I think I can reconstruct it. So a
Mhm.
comment. So the label for the view I defend in that paper is primitivist realism, which realism is just the view that colors are really out in the world. Primitivism just says like, well, and they're not identical with any of the properties that like physics tells us about, like reflectance properties or atomic microstructures or anything like that. So a common move that other primitivist realists make is to say like, well, it's true that you can explain our perceptions of color without positing colors, but we shouldn't conclude from that colors don't play any causal role, because we can say colors supervene on the underlying physical stuff. What that means is that given the underlying physical stuff, it's metaphysically necessary that there's also colors, even though colors aren't identical with those underlying physical
Right.
properties. And the thought is, well, as long as there's a kind of supervenience relation, that's enough to give colors causal relevance. An analogy you might give is like, suppose that uh, a, well, I don't know. Suppose that you can cause something like a scale to go down if you're over 80 pounds.
Hmm.
Okay, and then something walks on the scale and it's 83 pounds. Okay,
Hmm.
being 83 pounds, that property is causally sufficient for making the scale go down. But you could also cite the more general property of being over 80 pounds. That property is also relevant to making the scale go down. Okay, strictly that's not the same property as being 83 pounds, but it would be weird to say that that's not causally relevant. Okay,
Yeah.
so there are these other examples that convince philosophers that like, okay, one property can be causally sufficient for an effect, But other distinct properties, as long as they supervene on the underlying property, can also be causally relevant. That's fine
Right.
too. So all we need to say, according to this view, is, well, we need to say that like colors supervene on the underlying physical stuff, and that's enough to kind of secure their causal relevance, and that way they can kind of like play a causal role in generating our perceptions and so on. And the thing I don't like about that, just flat-footedly stated, is, well, fine, sure. If you could say that there's a supervenience relation there, then things would be okay. But the problem is there does not seem to be. There seems
It
not
seems to be false,
like
right?
all the kind of diagnostics for failures of supervenience seem to be there. Like I can totally conceive of the complete atomic microstructure of the tomato without any primitive red there. Okay, so like if you think of these kind of ideal conceivability as a diagnostic for possibility, then it actually looks possible that you could have all the kind of structural stuff described by physics there without the color, and I think that's right. So now you could say, okay, well that call that a modal appearance of an appearance of what's possible, an intellectual appearance of what's possible. You could say, well, that modal appearance is wrong, it's an illusion, but that would threaten to undermine the initial motivation for the realist view, which was like, okay, we're going to trust perceptual appearances because we think appearance gives us justification to believe their contents,
Yeah.
but now we're going to distrust the modal appearances that
Mm-hmm.
that push against our view. Like that looks a little bit unprincipled. So I kind of
Indeed, I agree. Mm-hmm.
let's trust both appearances, both the modal appearances and the perceptual appearances. But we can still say that there's a kind of supervenience, but it's not supervenience on. So here's my distinction between narrow and broad supervenience. So narrow supervenience is the claim that colors supervene on the kind of structural properties described by physics.
Right.
That I claim is wrong. Broad supervenience claims that colors supervene on the structural stuff plus the quantitative underpinnings. That I claim in the paper is true. And I claim in the paper the truth of that is all you need to secure the causal relevance of color. Okay, so, and further, I claim there's no relevant modal appearances that tell against broad supervenience, because we don't even know. I mean, the whole kind of Russell Eddington point was we have no insight into the nature of the quantitative realizers of physical structures.
Right.
And so there's just kind of like no appearances one way or the other concerning whether those would necessitate colors.
Mm-hmm.
So the main innovation of the paper is, well, we can have a kind of supervenience if you go in for quiddities and if you go in for this kind of Russellian monist inspired picture of how physical reality is related to color.
Yeah, and that's great. And that also relates to another concern you raised, just a basic concern of simplicity as well, and not being too inflationist and stuff like that. So
yeah.
Great. Well, I think we pretty much gave at least the general structure of the paper. We filled in a little bit of its intrinsic nature, perhaps. Is there anything we missed? Any other objections that maybe we should consider or anything? And then maybe we can spend a little bit of time on some of your other work.
I think that covers the main outline. So.
Yeah, great. Well, that's cool. And again, I'll link it in the show notes so people can check it out. I know we don't have a whole lot of time left, but I am very interested in this work that you've done on psychophysical harmony. So maybe we could just get the general structure out of that. And those jokes aren't very funny, so I'll stop. And I'd be curious to hear about your background with this, because the first time I kind of and I'll be honest, this is not an argument I've spent a lot of time on. It interests me, but I guess I'm still trying to think through it a lot. I remember there was a book a couple of years ago. It was like, I think it was edited by Doherty, like 12 or so arguments for God. And I feel like Swinburne made this kind of argument in that book. Is that right? Am I remembering right? I'm just kind of wondering what what maybe the launch pad for your recent development of it has been.
Good. So Swinburne in a number of places makes related arguments, but not really the same argument. So in his older book called The Existence of God, he's got a chapter, or a big part of a chapter, giving, I think, what he calls the argument from consciousness, and then he gives a kind of variation on that in the volume, two dozen or so arguments for God. Which I think there is called the argument from colors
and flavors or
even though
something like that.
he doesn't just focus on colors and flavors.
No, it's very broad. Yeah.
So there the point is not so much that there's a harmonious relation between consciousness and physical stuff. Swinburne's point there has to do with the fact that there's not going to be any very simple set of laws connecting kind of physical brain states with states of consciousness. And so it's going to be implausible to accept those as just kind of brute, metaphysically basic laws of nature as the naturalists has to.
Yeah.
I mean, the background assumption here is like, okay, some kind of dualism is correct, and so there's going to be laws of nature connecting physical brain states to states of consciousness.
Yeah.
And the question is whether we're going to accept those as rock bottom, metaphysically basic laws, or whether they're going to be explained by like the divine will or God's reasons and aims. And so there the focus is more on the complexity of the psychophysical connection and less to do with the
harmony,
harmonious correspondence between consciousness and matter, which is the focus of Maya and Dustin's paper.
Okay, yeah, great distinction. That's actually very helpful. So go ahead and set us up for this. How do you like to introduce this argument, Dr. Cutter?
Yeah, so I maybe the most useful general frame or gestalt to have in thinking about this argument is by analogy to the fine-tuning argument. So the fine-tuning argument says that certain fundamental physical parameters, like basic constants that figure in the laws of nature, fall within a very narrow life-permitting range. If they're a little bit bigger or smaller or different, life wouldn't have been possible, and argues that this is evidence for theism or some kind of design hypothesis. My and Dustin's argument is broadly similar, except we focus on what we call the psychophysical laws rather than kind of laws of physics and cosmology.
Right.
Psychophysical laws, that's just fancy philosopher name for the laws of nature that connect mind and matter. The laws of nature that say roughly like when something has such and such brain state, then it has such and such state of consciousness.
Right.
Now, a background assumption that we work with, at least in a lot of the paper, is that states of consciousness are distinct from states of matter. So it's these are kind of laws of nature connecting distinct properties, distinct realities. It's not like a feeling of pain just is a certain pattern of neurons firing in your brain. There's the neurons firing in your brain. There's a feeling of pain. Those are distinct things, but of course, uncontroversially, they're kind of systematically related. There's a kind of reliable connection. Like every time that these neurons fire in just this way, I have a feeling of pain of exactly this intensity. So there's some kind of like reliable systematic correspondence here. But since these are distinct realities with neither reducible to the other, we're going to have something like laws of nature connecting them.
Sure.
And these are empirically discovered laws of nature. They aren't just a priori. And the claim is that if you look at how the psychophysical laws in fact pair states of consciousness with states of the brain and behavior and so on, it seems kind of suspiciously lucky in a lot of ways. It seems really kind of nicely harmonious or fortunate in a way that seems to cry out for explanation. We argue that the kind of harmony that we see is very unlikely if these laws are not kind of chosen by God or the result of a being who aims at realizing value. If something like naturalism is true, it's very, very unlikely that we would get laws that exhibit this kind of fortunate harmony. Therefore, there's kind of Bayesian evidence for theism on the basis of psychophysical harmony, that the harmonious nature of the psychophysical laws was much more likely given theism or something like theism than it was on naturalism. Therefore, you kind of run through the Bayesian mechanics and you get confirmation of theism or something like it over naturalistic atheism. Okay, so then natural next question. Okay, in what ways are they harmonious? In what ways are these psychophysical laws harmonious? Well, one straightforward example just has to do with pleasure and pain. So there's certain circumstances in which our brain state gives rise to pain. There's other circumstances in which a different brain state gives rise to pleasure. And the brain state that gives rise to pain is also associated with and causes behavior that tends to lead to the elimination of pain. That's the very kind of behavior that pain itself rationally justifies. The behavior, the because we assume that like pain is kind of objectively bad, or at least
Right.
pain are. Similarly, the brain states that give rise to pleasure, those very brain states also kind of lead us to behave in ways that reinforce and promote those sorts of experiences, which is kind of nice because pleasure is kind of an objectively good thing, or at least certain kinds of pleasure is. You could imagine psychophysical laws that kind of inverted the roles of pleasure and pain, where like the brain states that lead us to exhibit avoidance behavior give rise to pleasure, and the brain states that lead to reinforcement behavior give rise to pain. In that case, we would always be acting in ways that kind of give us more of the objectively bad experience and give us less of the objectively good experience. That would be a horrible situation. Or you can imagine other kind of disharmonious scenarios where, like maybe kind of the avoidance behavior that we associate with pain, maybe that goes with like a neutral experience of gray. So we're kind of like systematically avoiding an experience that we objectively have no reason to avoid, and maybe systematically pursuing experiences that we objectively have no reason to pursue, that aren't objectively good in any way. And so there'd be a kind of mismatch between like the ways in which we're disposed to behave and the actual experiences we have. That's not the way the laws of psychophysics turned out. They turned out in this very nice, friendly, fortunate, harmonious, to have this feature of harmony. And our claim is this kind of calls out for explanation. It calls out for explanation because, as we argue, kind of the vast majority of conceivable ways of pairing up physical states with experiences would not be harmonious in anything like the way that the actual psychophysical laws are harmonious. So just like fine tuning, where you say the vast majority of values that this constant could have taken would have led to a dead, lifeless world, but as it happens, they took life-permitting values. That calls out for explanation. So too, we claim that if the vast majority of possible psychophysical laws would have been crappy and unfortunate and disharmonious, then the fact that the psychophysical laws that prevail in our world are harmonious, that calls out for explanation. And we argue that, this is just much more likely on theism than it is on naturalism. So it's some kind of Bayesian evidence for theism against naturalism.
Yeah. Wow. You got that out quick. Well rehearsed. Excellent. All right. So let's maybe we just consider an objection or two to that argument. One of the objections to fine tuning that it seems like doesn't get discussed a lot and isn't taken up by many people, but it is taken up by a few really smart people, is that it's just necessary. Right? And I guess if I were trying to press back against and for what it's worth, I actually think the necessity objection is one of the hardest ones to deal with fine tuning. In one sense, I feel like you can almost dismiss it out of hand, but in another sense, I think it's one of the ones that's actually you got to do some real work to get that one out of the way, right? So it's kind of like the best and worst objection, almost. That's how I feel about it to the fine tuning argument. I guess I would try and maybe do something like that. Again, I haven't thought about your argument that much, so I don't have this thought out in any precise format. But I'm wondering if there could be some sort of necessity, maybe an a priori physicalism or something. I don't know. You probably thought about this, I suspect.
Yeah. So there are a few things to say here. So one, I guess I think that if that objection works against the standard fine-tuning argument, then it works against our argument. But I don't think it works against the standard fine-tuning argument, and maybe I'll say a little bit about why. So maybe here's an analogy. So let's backing up a little bit. I think a good heuristic.
Let me since you're going to give a detailed response, let me frame this a little bit more. So this is actually Graham Oppy's objection to fine tuning, right? So he thinks that there's good reason to think that there's some initial physical state to reality, and if it had a beginning, if the universe had a beginning, it was necessary it had a beginning, and it was necessary that it had just the sort of setup that it did, right? And he thinks that's adequate to sort of defang the fine tuning argument, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good. So maybe here's an analogy. Suppose we see a message written in the stars spelling out like I am the Alpha and the Omega, or a Bible verse or something like that. I take it it's clear that would be good evidence for something like theism.
Mm-hmm.
But now consider someone who says, but maybe like Spinozism is right and all truths are necessary, including this truth about the arrangement of stars. And so actually, it couldn't have been otherwise that the stars took on this particular message-like arrangement, so we can't conclude anything from this arrangement. First of all, there's got to be something wrong with this objection. For one reason, because clearly that would be good evidence for theism, and now it's just a question of diagnosing where the objection goes wrong. But another reason to see that there's got to be something wrong with that is that would undermine not just this as evidence for theism, but basically anything as evidence for anything. So suppose I just see a message-like arrangement of leaves in my yard, or a message like arrangement of marks on a piece of paper, and I conclude from that someone wrote me a message. Forget about God, just like someone. But but if you could say, but maybe that arrangement was necessary, and therefore we can't conclude anything from it. Now like all reasoning is out the window. All kind of scientific reasoning is out the window. So, okay, so that's just an initial reason to be suspicious of this. But here's where let me just diagnose where I think this goes wrong. The hypothesis that the laws, whatever they turn out to be, are necessary doesn't predict psychophysical harmony, because a priori we don't know what the psychophysical laws are going to be like. So we might think in advance, whatever the laws are, they couldn't have been otherwise. But that doesn't give us any guidance as to what the laws actually are. So it doesn't actually predict that the laws will be harmonious. Similarly, in the case of fine-tuning, suppose we think in advance, the parameter values, whatever they turn out to be, were metaphysically necessary. That doesn't at all predict that they will be within the narrow life permitting range. In fact, like our a priori credence distribution over the possible values should be just as it is if we think in advance that it's going to be contingent, whatever it turns out to be. Just like, take the star arrangement. Like, even if I'm a kind of Spinozist, so I believe with Spinoza that however the stars turn out to be arranged, they had to be arranged in just that way. That necessitism doesn't predict any particular arrangement. My kind of epistemic credence distribution over the star arrangements should be just the same as it would be if I thought, it's going to be contingent how the stars turn out.
Right.
Sorry. So that's the first point. Necessitism about the laws or about the constant values just doesn't predict fine-tuning. But, we claim that theism does predict, or at least makes it more likely that we would find fine-tuning. So we still get Bayesian evidence for theism against necessitist versions of atheism.
Right.
Now you could say,
that's good.
Well, maybe the view that the constant values, whatever they turn out to be, are necessary. That doesn't predict fine-tuning. But here's something that does predict fine-tuning. That claim plus and the constant values fall within this narrow life permitting. So that does predict fine-tuning, but at the cost of having a negligibly low prior.
An exceedingly complex theory, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's just like the point that
right, in the same sense that God plus this world with all of its specific instances of suffering perfectly predicts this world of all of its specific instances of the suffering, right? Yeah.
So you can always make a more specific version of a theory that predicts the evidence just as well as you like.
Yeah.
But that's typically going to come to you're going to increase the likelihoods by borrowing from the priors. You're not going to come out ahead in the end. And so
that's good.
So I guess that's why I think the necessity objection doesn't work to the traditional fine-tuning argument, and so it equally fails.
That's a great response. That's exactly, I think that's exactly right. I think it's also, when you think about it, it's evidence that for contingency as well. but we can leave that aside. Okay.
Yeah.
I know we're kind of at our last couple minutes here. So is there anything we missed? Any other like objection that you think is important that you just want to throw out there real quick? I know you've had recent conversations more detailed on this, so I'll try and make sure I find those and link those in the show notes so people can follow up and dive a little deeper into this.
Yeah. I guess maybe one thing I'd say is that the thing I think is coolest about the psychophysical harmony argument is that I think it's not vulnerable to what I think of as the main objection to the traditional fine-tuning argument. So I think the only halfway decent objection to the standard fine-tuning argument is the multiverse response.
Multiverse, yeah.
Now, there's a lot of tricky issues in evaluating the multiverse response. I'm not at all confident that it works at the end of the day, but it at least can give the argument a run for its money. It's a serious objection in the way that I think a lot of objections appealing to like anthropic reasoning are just kind of like can be decisively refuted. They're just like they might seem plausible at the face, but you can just kind of decisively show that they're wrong. I haven't seen a decisive takedown of the multiverse response, and I've thought about it a lot. So I guess my take on the fine-tuning the traditional fine-tuning argument is that fine-tuning should raise our credence both in theism and in the multiverse, but maybe doesn't give us kind of very decisive reason on its own to favor theism over a multiverse.
Yeah.
But
and by the way, I'm with you. I think the best way to deal with the multiverse objection is to consider other reasons and arguments. Right?
Yeah. But given that background, I think it's a significant advantage of the psychophysical harmony argument that it doesn't seem to be vulnerable to a multiverse objection. And the main reason for that, so it's a little bit subtle. So on the one hand, it's true that if you have a big enough multiverse, then you can make it likely that there would be some universe that has harmonious psychophysical laws. That much is unproblematic. But the other thing you need for the multiverse response to work is for there to be a kind of observation selection effect. So in the traditional fine-tuning argument, so we've got the multiverse that's big and varied enough such that we can expect at least some universes are life permitting.
Right.
And moreover, you can argue pretty straightforwardly that it's no surprise that we find ourselves in one of the life permitting ones, given that there just aren't observers around at all in the non-life permitting ones. So that's the kind of observation selection effect. We couldn't have observed ourselves in one of the non-life permitting universes because we couldn't have existed in such a universe. If you've got some putative piece of evidence that doesn't come with an observation selection effect, then multiverse responses just don't work at all. So suppose I just like observe someone like rise from the dead after being prayed for. I take it like no one would think it's plausible to say like, this isn't evidence for theism, because if there's a big enough multiverse, then there would be like some random assemblage of atoms that causes a dead person to rise from the dead. I mean, that's true. Given a big enough multiverse, you would get weird stuff like that happening in some universes, but it's still true that the vast majority of observers wouldn't find themselves observing anything like that. And so that's why a multiverse response to like that kind of evidence just wouldn't carry any weight at all.
Yeah, that's
and
a good
we argue
point.
that there's not really an observation selection effect associated with psychophysical harmony, because we could exist as observers in worlds where there's not psychophysical harmony, or at least the kind. So imagine like the pain, pleasure, inversion worlds, but where everything else is held fixed, just as it is in our world. Well, we would still exist as observers in those worlds, but it would just be disharmonious. So you don't have the kind of observation selection effect for the datum of psychophysical harmony that you have for the datum of life permitting values. And so for that reason, I think the most powerful response to the standard fine-tuning argument just doesn't work against the psychophysical harmony argument.
That's great. That is definitely an advantage and a very cool feature of your argument. Dr. Cutter, thank you so much for being here. Before we say goodbye, is there anything you want to announce, anything new you're working on, or just ways people can keep up with you or your work, a website or anything like that?
No.
A Twitter perhaps?
I don't tweet, but I guess I've got a Phil Papers page. You can follow me there. I've also got a website if you just Google my name, and maybe Brian Cutter Philosophy. You can find it easily, where I've got all my publications, including kind of recent stuff on all the issues that we've been talking about. And hopefully I'll be writing more on psychophysical harmony soon. I'm trying to co-author another thing with Dustin on the same topic. So yeah, you can follow my website or follow my Phil papers, or shoot me an email if you're interested in anything we talked about today.
Great. Thank you so much. And gentle listeners, thank you for tuning in. We appreciate it. We hope you got something out of the conversation, and please leave your comments and thoughts below. We'll catch you guys next time.